of capital. And I think of that as a bit of a miracle. That's an amazing achievement to bring into the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and one of the big reasons I'm looking forward to talking with Bev today, is that I think her elucidation of the project of Capital Volume 3 points all of us who care toward better, clearer, more everyday ways of talking about capitalism, while also expanding our sense of the moving target that capital forms for all of us. In the Automatic Fetish, Bev has made the stakes higher, but the rewards greater. It's a very clear book about a very hard book that when you're done, makes the hard book look crystal clear. So I'm really glad to be here with you all today. And Bev, where would you like to start? I have a thought for you, but we could start anywhere you like.
So is the mic good for me?
A little soft.
A little soft. How's that? Is that better?
Just a tiny bit
A
closer.
little closer.
Yeah.
How's that? Better?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I'm gonna start just with a couple thank yous, if that's okay. Thank you to Philip for the invitation and for organizing this, and thank you for all of the Red May organizers. And thank you, Chris, for agreeing to do this with me. That was kind. And thank you to everyone who showed up here today with some curiosity about this book. I really appreciate that. Yeah, where should we start? Maybe just with kind of something that you mentioned, which has to do with what kept me motivated to keep reading through Volume 3, which is just an astonishment, I think, about how the systematic and the complexity, I think, and I think quite the magnificent complexity of and systematicity of the analysis in Volume 3. That's what kept me kind of, chugging through the project, which took a really long time. And so I think if there is anything, that's something that I don't say in the book, and so I thought maybe I wanted to say was just how astonishing I found the analysis to be, and wanted to try to capture that. And it's completeness, because I went in also to the project with the kind of, Volume 3 by hearsay, what its reputation as being unfinished, as being, as something that you approach with a little bit of suspicion, because probably Engels screwed it up on somehow in his editing of it. So it was a little bit that something that you didn't fully trust. And then as I worked through the book for the first time systematically, which wasn't the first, so I too, like probably I imagine most people, approached it in bits and pieces and chunks here and there. I knew that somewhere in Volume 3, Marx unfurled this argument or that argument, and then he would kind of find those places and read them. And then it was after 2008. It was after the global financial meltdown that I decided I wanted to understand more clearly for myself why that happened and how that happened, and knew that Volume 3 was a place to look for Marx's analysis of financial crisis, but amongst many things, and then started to work through the book systematically from the first page to the last, and then I couldn't believe it, because it was entirely different from what I had expected that I would find.
Yeah.
Its coherency was what I wasn't prepared for and kept being endlessly surprised by. And until you get to the end of part, until you get to there's 6 parts that feel as though they're more or less complete as a material, and then part 7, Marx is kind of wrapping it up at the end. It's as if with each part, Marx is adding another piece of the orchestra. you know. And each piece starts playing with the other piece. So another section of the orchestra enters, and then they all start playing together. And then by the time you get to part 6, the whole orchestra is playing together. And it's actually quite breathtaking as when you start to see the interconnectedness of the whole analysis, which of course is, you know, the complexity is because it's the complexity of the object that Marx is trying to grasp.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the magic of the book. I mean, you give a sense both of the complexity and of the clarity of the analysis at the same time. And, you know, I several years ago tried to teach a seminar where we dipped into volume 3, and we did our best, but it'll never feel the same now that you've written this incredibly lucid book. And for all those of you, you know, who haven't had a chance yet to read Bev's prose, it's a real gift to us all as a guide to this book. You know, one of the things about that kind of architectural or conceptual or symphonic beauty that you and I have had a chance to talk about a little bit is that, you know, this book, the third volume of Capital, looks like it's about the most arcane stuff in a way. Like, what do lenders do? What do merchants do when they're amongst themselves? What do landlords do when they're in competition with each other? But what you help us see is that those are both extremely attenuated expressions of a social relationship, but very powerful expressions, of course, of this social relationship. And by the time you get to the last piece of the symphony playing, including in your account of the symphony, you can still see back to the beginning and hear the simple sort of like opening notes. And I think that's part of what makes it feel different. So if Marx is looking at this really arcane stuff, what you help us see is that he never loses sight of the simple thing that's the engine for all the complicated stuff. And the way I think about that, because of what you demonstrate in the book, is that a good way to think about the germ of it all, those first notes in the symphony, is the distinction between profit in its everyday sense, like when we just kind of close our eyes and think about making a profit, and surplus value. And so I thought, you know, that might be a nice place for folks here to begin to think about how your book begins and how Marx's book begins, but just taking a minute to say, like, what that distinction is and what it starts to help us see as it gets caught up in more and more types of activity, but remains what it is. So yeah, surplus value and profit.
Yeah. That's another thing that is remarkable, is that there is a through line that goes from the first page to the last. And it is, I think one way of thinking about it is the way in which surplus value, and I'll back up and kind of gloss that, but the way in which surplus value that is generated in production is transformed into this phenomenon that we call profit, right? Or profit, the profit of enterprise, the profit that is then shared up and divided up in many different ways. Profit at enterprise, rent, interest, some that goes back, wages, and so on. But what becomes for Marx in Volume 3, what he refers to as the fetish, or the movement of the fetish, is the way in which profit, or surplus value that is created in production, but then becomes this empirical surface phenomenon that we call profit, is a way then mystifies that it is the same thing as surplus value, and mystifies the source of surplus value, which for Marx is always the outcome of collective labor, socialized labor in production. Right? So in a way, that's what you have, that's what, you know, there's a couple things that you need to take from Volume 1 with you and put in your pocket and take when you move, if you move to Volume 3. And one of those is, where does surplus value come from? So Marx is presupposing that readers who are approaching Volume 3 remember from Volume 1 that surplus value is only generated in production. It's the differential between the value that is produced in collective by the mobilizing of labor collectively in production, the amount of the magnitude, the definite magnitude of value that is created there, versus the value that returns as an investment in labor power. So that goes back to workers in the form of wages. So that differential is surplus value, or the surplus value, which Marx says, remember too, and he does this more consistently in Volume 3. Remember then that surplus value is always surplus labor, always collectively produced, but always appropriated as someone's private property. Right? There's the key. So, Marx's almost mantra through Volume 3 is surplus value is produced by us collectively. It is what we do. It is the outcome of collective doing and making in the course of producing things. But that then disappears, or sometimes I think the way that I put it in the book is then surplus value disappears into its everyday form of profit. So profit then severs that perceptual link between, wealth in its capitalist form and its source in living labor and production.
That's super helpful. I mean, one of the things also that you highlight towards the beginning of the book is that mystification that reduces down the social dynamic of the production of surplus value and just counts it as a number, profit. That mystification is something that not only we're all subject to if we're arguing about our salaries or our wages or access to salary or wage, but that capitalists are compelled to mystify themselves about. And there are two really cool and helpful ways that I think you do that as you set up the book. And one is like almost about capitalist bookkeeping and about how they smush together two very different things that also come to us from Volume 1 of Capital, constant and variable capital, and they count them as the same kind of thing in their own bookkeeping. And that mixes and mingles a really local thing to their work site, their factory, whatever, and a social thing. And acts as if they're the same. And that causes them not to be able to grasp their own role in the social dynamic. That's one thing that I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit, because it seems like profit is this hyper-local, it's just my number thing for any one capitalist, whereas surplus value is like a social, it's not the same kind of relationship to numbers. And related to that, there's something really great that you say early on that I think helps make the book, both Capital Volume 3, but your book, feel like we're moving forward and forward and forward, which is that you find it theoretically important that there's like some, whether you could ever count it, because it's in motion, total amount of surplus value, that not totally being aware of it, all the capitalists are divvying up among themselves. And there's this place where you say capitalists think that they're at war with each other, but they're actually working for each other, like as a class. And so those things really set up everything else you do in the book. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, because those are two ways that like capitalists act as a class to make a social dynamic around surplus value that they misunderstand as profit. And that'd be cool to hear you say something about that.
Yeah, that is one. It's one of my favorite kind of conceptual inversions. I think because it's just kind of it's quite remarkable. It's quite breathtaking when you kind of think of part of the movement that Marx is trying to capture in Volume 3. If we think about surplus value, then taking this transformed form of profit in the world as it actually is, and for Marx, that is the dynamic to keep your eye on. That there's a kind of internal set of dynamics and mechanisms that then produce the appearances of how that capital machine works on the surface of things. That doesn't just distort and mystify, it actually turns things upside down. And one of these kinds of, flipping on its head for Marx is this, where he plays out a version of this dynamic from by differentiating the standpoints between capital as a machine and the standpoint of the capitalist and what capitalists do.
Yeah.
So he says, we think of the kind of everyday world of capitalist competition as capitalists, battling it out amongst themselves for supremacy, for higher profits, for viability, for survival. So we think of this, and he says, yes, okay, that is happening. He says, yes, but really what's happening under the surface of things is that, he says, the truth of capital can really only be understood if we think of capital as a machine, as a totalized machine that is pumping out surplus value. And in fact, he says, the capitalist class are all working together to pump surplus value into one common value reservoir. Right? So on the one hand, he says, you have on the surface of things, capitalists kind of competing to best each other. And then he says, but really, capitalists are also supporting each other in this project of producing a common pool or reservoir amongst themselves. And then he says, but look, what also has to happen for a capitalist system to remain viable at all is that this competition on the surface of things must also articulate invisibly a process of equalizing profit out amongst the members of the bearers of the capitalist class. Why? And value is the name that Marx gives to this process of constantly equalizing profit. Why? So Marx says, well, look, if you had a system, and remember, this is the important thing to remember is it is a system of socialized production where the product of socialized production takes the form of private property. That's key to keep in mind. So he says, how could you do that? Well, if it's a system of competitive enterprise, there's no organizing of production. No one tells you what you can produce. Your viability of enterprise entails that you can survive and best your competition, or survive in the battle of competition. But Marx says, yes, but a capitalist system is also a complex division of labor. This is a system of generalized exchange, right? This is where every capitalist needs what a different capitalist produce, right? If I produce widget A, I can produce widget A because someone else out there is producing widget B, C, D, E, and F, and my enterprise depends on the viability of all those other enterprises. So every capitalist needs the other members of the capitalist class to stay in business. But more than that, each capitalist, the movement of value is also the equalizing of profit margins. Why? Because if the manufacturer of widget A systematically produces, makes, let's say, a profit of 50%, while the manufacturer of widget B systematically makes a profit of 10%. Marx says you would never have capital even emerge as a system because no one in their right mind would produce widget B. Right? He said capitalism, in order not only for capital to emerge, but for capital to reproduce itself as a system, it must reproduce itself as a system that internally redistributes profit roughly equally amongst the members of the capitalist class. So he calls this, a kind of inadvertent or a kind of a subterranean sort of Freemasonry of the capitalist class. He says, in fact, they're all working for each other. They're all, they all need each other, and they need that profit be distributed roughly equally.
Yeah, there's this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, I was just going to say there's a it's a phrase, I didn't write it down exactly, but it jumped out at me the first time I read your book, and you say something like capitalism is a system of social averages and tipping points, and I just don't think I've heard capital and capitalist reproduction described that way so clearly before. And you've been describing kind of like social averages in one sense, like an equalization of the rate of profit across capitalist sectors, it looks like the big tech companies and their huge rates of profit define our age in some way, unrelated to all the lower profitability firms out there doing, more labor-intensive kind of accumulation. But what you help us see, and what you suggest that Marx is helping us see, is they have to look at those things in tandem. But what about the tipping points part?
Yeah.
Could you say something about that? Because
Yeah.
this is also a place,
Yeah.
famously where you're supposed to get in there and think about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and think about credit and how that introduces crisis possibilities that didn't used to exist into capitalism. And so, is the tipping point thing that you're describing related to that stuff? It's an interesting way of thinking about capitalist accumulation.
Yeah. I like that. I found that helpful, and I kind of landed on that to think of the movement of value itself. Capital is a value-producing machine and a value-redistributing machine, right? To think of value then is this kind of thermostat, internal thermostat, that keeps production, that compels producers to always produce within a range of labor time that makes it possible for the machine to keep reproducing itself. If you're a producer, so that tipping point, or that social average, value is always a historical kind of congealing or momentary congealing of an average of social productivity. So if you have a system of generalized production, right, where production is not organized, something has to kind of keep the system turning over. What producers are exchanging amongst themselves has to, the product itself has to be comparable in one way. So Marx says the only way that can happen is if an average of socially necessary labor time becomes the substance of the historical content of value itself. Right? The social product then, whatever a manufacturer produces, is a congealed amount of labor time. That labor time is a social average, so it's not any particular producer's actual labor time that it took to produce something, but the value of any product or the value of the commodity becomes this social average.
Yeah.
Right. It has to be, and Marx shows, that is the one, I think, interesting thing that became clear to me after Volume 3 that didn't fully become clear to me after Volume 1, was just why that was the case, right? And so the tipping point, commodities produced, it sells, it goes to market, the price itself of any commodity is then the freezing of socially necessary, of a social average level of productivity, a historical level of productivity, right? So that's what I was trying to grasp with social averages and tipping points. Now, what gets lost of all that, of course, is the human terms, and we haven't been talking about that, but there's pretty dire, I know we'll get there, pretty dire human terms when this system is left to its own kind of internal devices in this way, right? Because those social averages of productivity are the averaging out of actual human beings' expended labor, right, which congeals in the product and the social product itself, which might find a buyer on the market, might not. If it doesn't, that's a waste. Then that commodity is devalued, as if that human labor didn't exist, didn't happen, was wasted, expended, or can't be used, because what that social average as a kind of silent compulsion means is that as a producer, you must produce, or manufacturer, you must work within this kind of range of possibility for viability. And that which means you keep your prices down, you keep the cost of production down within a viable average.
Yeah, well, the language of average and tipping points, this is kind of like mathematical and, mathematics adjacent language. And one of the things I really appreciate about your book as a way into reading Volume 3 is that you show us that the numbers are always there for a reason. The way Marx thinks about them is often in ratios that are shifting all the time. And I find that very helpful. And so when you talk about the human costs, I mean, some of the things I wanted to ask you about were things like, or that I wanted to, first of all, say is that, the work you do around Volume 3 makes it, I think, easier to push back against mainstream economic language around, like, say, histories of certain times and places. Well, hey, capitalism works because in nation X during decade Y, the wages of the working classes rose. It doesn't necessarily produce immiseration, because look at this example of this time and space. And you help enable us to think about the way you need to say, like, well, at whose expense? Because there's a kind of zero summiness in that pool of surplus value, or that single pool that can't be forgotten analytically. And so, I mean, you're really good with kind of like metaphorical language when you want to use it or whatever. And I keep thinking of like the cat's cradle. Like if you tug in one direction, somebody else has to tilt in the other. And that's a kind of dynamic that's all the more vivid in Volume 3, it seems like. But a kind of political question about those human costs jumped to mind. It's about halfway through the book in your third chapter where you say something really wonderful that I'd love to hear you talk about. But it's about how you say something like capitalist exploitation breeds many different forms, complex forms of stratification among people who are forced to work, forced not to work, unable to work, all those kinds of things. But that dynamic is also, and actually, quite simplifying. The dynamic of exploitation generates so many different relations to value, but there's a way to look at it in all its complexity and see it as something very socially simplifying. And that seems potentially very useful politically, especially in a context where people who maybe know a little bit about the arguments in Volume 1 say, oh, that was cool for the 19th century, but look at us now. We've got investment banks and multinationals and people whose work relationships are only like gig work and who aren't full-time factory laborers. And what does Marx's analysis have to say about that world? Yeah. So that moment in your book felt like a really cool open door towards saying, like, there's a lot this book has to say about this world. Yeah. So simplification and stratification, how both are going on at the same time.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna put two things together. Yes, one of the motivations for this project was to demonstrate the sheer relevance, I think, of this analysis right up to the present. Necessity, even. I just don't think it's relevant. I think it's absolutely necessary to make sense of the kind of surface forms and movements of capitalist society today, from how to understand unemployment and a growing surplus population of people who are rendered completely unabsorbable by the formal economy, to the housing crisis, to cost of living crisis, to inflation, to the proliferation of new kind of imaginary monies and the pretending that you can make money through blockchains and so on and so forth. Like I really think that you can take that Capital 3 unlocks, in some ways, contemporary capital more so than the capital of Marx's day. That's my, that's my bet. That's my pitch. I think it does. So that was, I think that's a remarkable thing about it. But okay, but yes, okay, why? Because in this, one of the human costs of this machine that must always be calibrated to social averages of labor time is the necessity of keeping the costs of production low and competitive. And throwing human beings out of work or lowering the cost of production by getting rid of the human element in production is one of the ways that capital systematically does that to keep costs low. So a lot has been written lately about the ways in which then capital, in rendering, in one of its moments anyway, rendering human beings superfluous to the process of accumulation, is the way in which then technologies, other technologies of oppression, technologies of racialization or gender or sexuality or age or other ways of differentiating people in order to distribute resources differently or wealth differently. A lot, and I always think of what is by now Ruth Wilson Gilmore's now kind of famous line, where she says, capitalism requires difference and racism enshrines it. Now I want to put that is absolutely true. But I want to say that that's one side of a piece of paper, and here's the other side of the piece of paper, which is that at the very same time, capital requires the abstraction of difference to produce this, invisible substance called value. That is the outcome, that is the substance of human labor. It requires the abstraction of difference. It requires that wealth become units of entirely undifferentiated socialized wealth or abstract wealth. It does that at the very same time. So I want to kind of say, I want Ruth Gilmore's aphorism on one side of the piece of paper, and then the other side of the piece of paper I want to say capital requires equalization, and profitability enshrines it. Mm-hmm. Because, that is, capital must evacuate everything that is particular about concrete human labor in the formation of this, the history, I'll finish that sentence, social or abstract wealth. So the history of the emergence of capital is the history of the transition from a dominance of wealth in kind, or what I think of as wealth in kind, to an abstract, to a different form of wealth, abstract wealth, or socialized wealth.
Yeah.
And
can I ask a question?
Yes.
This is the place as we round the corner in your book. So the book has two parts. It's got its own beautiful symmetry, and in the first part, you're talking about this dynamic of pooling of surplus value in production and competition and how that leads to crisis. And then in the second half of the book, which is I think what we're starting to talk about, we're thinking about the parts of Capital Volume 3 where different surface expressions through powerful social practices take hold of of reproducing the capital relation. So what merchants do in commercial profit, what lenders do to create credit for super expensive enterprises, and what landlords do. So we're rounding the bend, and as we get to that second half of your book and of Capital Volume 3, these political questions about differing life chances is another way that Gilmore talks about it, start to come really to the fore in your book. And I wonder, so this is a question for you, I've tried out different ways of seeing if I get what you're saying about kind of difference in stratification and the other side of the paper. Would you feel okay if I said something like, you helped teach me that we could say capitalists are willing to pick up on the histories that predate them and leverage and invent all kinds of social relationships as long as they are the ultimate end of reproducing capital and surplus value? So that could be enslaved labor, that could be various kinds of part-time labor, that could be child labor, that could be indenture, it could be all kinds of things that existentially and collectively and historically we experience as completely separate histories of completely different types of domination, though after a certain point in history, it seems like Marx wants to suggest that those are not different, but they are in the service of the same goal. Would you be okay if I said that that's something I picked up from your book? Yeah? Okay.
I think that is the point. I think that's absolutely Marx's point, which is that, and I'm going to bring in the idea of mediation here, or the way in which sometimes pre-existing or old or pre-capitalist relations of domination, customary or traditional, customary, based on sometimes religion or sometimes other ways of dividing people and hierarchizing people. Marx wants to show the way in which sometimes on the surface of things, those modalities,
Yeah, look at that.
oh, yeah, okay, sorry about that. Start all over. Let's start again. The ways in which those relationships on the surface of things might not appear to be any different or might kind of carry on as they did before. But Marx's argument is that now what we can't see is the evacuation of that traditional historical content of those relations of domination, and now their mediation, ultimately their mediation by the relation, the capital-labor relation, so that enslaved labor as a dominant form, predominant or transitional, I think Marx's argument, and I don't get into that in this book, but as a transitional mode of production to capital, is something different after capital is standing on its feet. Whatever it says, after capital is full blown, after capital has reached a point where it is the predominant mode of surviving and existing. Any instances of coercive labor, enslaved labor, other forms of laboring and labor production are then mediated by capital itself,
Right.
which fills them, is if to kind of evacuate them of one historical content and fill them with a new kind of historical.
Yeah, I love that. And the science fiction fan of me thinks like, oh, body snatching. It's
yeah.
the same, going from like, I am a small business owner to I am a small, but it's in relation to this thing out here, this gravitational force, and an important metaphor that you use, a gravitational field that's been created that makes stuff that has existed for a long time trope in a completely new direction.
Yeah.
So it both is what it is, and it's no longer what it was.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time, Red Bay organizers? I got two questions I'd love to ask Bev if there's time, but
Yeah, go ahead, ask the questions, then we take the audience.
Okay. Is that cool?
Yeah.
So I mean, one thing towards the very end of the book, it's in the section on ground rent, which is super interesting, and if you're trying to think about the politics of gentrification, you want to use a book like this. Bev does an amazing job of giving us a really lucid account of Marx's theory of rent as always differential. That is to say, some rent is higher than other rent or lower than other rent, and that's the point. And you start out theorizing it from what Bev reminds us Marx says is the worst land. Super interesting. But in that part of your book, you say, you're winding up the narration, you're getting to the end of the symphony here, you say this wonderful thing that I'd like to hear you talk about for 1 second. Capital's self-narration is an endless line of newly dressed up versions of itself that are always already obsolete. Capital's kidding itself. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because this is a book in some ways about ideology and ideology critique, but from a really different angle.
Yeah.
We haven't touched on that, but part of what's special about Bev's book is it allows us to think about ideology, what it is, what kind of weapon it is, what it does to us, what we can do about it by being, conceptual thinkers or people who can follow the bouncing ball, whatever, really differently. So that thing about capital kidding itself seems like an interesting way to begin thinking about the new way that you help us think about ideology. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Marx, that wasn't my point. That's Marx's point. I mean, Marx says, thinkers, commentators, vulgar economists or the bourgeois economists are going to come up with versions, stories. Capital's going to offer up its own self-narrative, its self-images, the way that it's going to explain how things work. And Marx says, capital is this machine that is constantly moving. And in order to keep accumulation, it's stuck with one particular mode of accumulation. But in an attempt to kind of keep that mode turning over, it's constantly reinventing itself. So at any point, when it reaches some kind of image of itself or narrative of itself, or any kind of explanation kind of settles into common sense about how this works, Marx says capital's already moved on. So any kind of image of itself, any common sense, is always an anachronism. You know, and I'm not, and it's not, but that's an important piece of information. I mean, capital's own self, its images, its narratives, this is, you know, as Marx says, those are real. Those are the real forms. Those are those social forms. You know, what I think he's getting at with the term superstructure is the world in which we actually live. This is the world that capital, that is the expression of those internal invisible dynamics, because this is the world that we live in. And that's an important, so it's important to kind of clock what's going on, but just to remember that it is going to be the upside down version of what's actually happening.
Yeah, you guys, so how many people have had a chance to start reading this book? Anybody? Yeah, so some of you, yeah. So like among the many mind blowers that I credit to your elucidation of Marx, you know, but is that very casually embedded in your book is a really new way to think about base and superstructure, right? So when people come at Marx and say, you know, or Marxists and say like, look, you all have this really blockish idea. There's like a bunch of machines and factories, it's the base. And then there's like the silly or the cool or the ideological or the revolutionary ideas in our head, and that's the superstructure. It's like the clouds and the dirt. But what you are saying that Marx is saying is that the superstructure is like the places and the times, where we live, how we live, you know, the buildings, the jobs, that's all the stuff. The money is the superstructure. And the shifting shell game, that is value that has to be produced constantly but can't ever be produced in any one place by any one group of capitalists, that is that thing you were talking about before, A, B, C, D, and E, that's inisolable and therefore feels like it's not even material. That's the base. The superstructure is our lives. And that's like a really different way of thinking about that. And it's so much better. So, I mean, I'm very grateful to you for making that part of the toolbox by which we can talk to each other, and by which, you know, maybe many people in this room want to talk to like people who are skeptical about this as a way of approaching the contemporary world. It's a gift that you gave us, I think. Can I ask you one last thing? And this is the thing that, you know, if you dipped into Capital Volume 3, one of the things that is kind of famously said about it is like there's really interesting stuff about credit and the credit system in there. And you know, again, a kind of wonderful whoa moment, which is like with the rise of a fully blown credit system, you know, capitalists can undertake these projects that are far vaster than anyone capital could fund, but also like capitalists don't own their own capital is part of the takeaway. And that seems related to this stuff that's always perplexed me, but that Marx is very clear about, which is, and you say it in a really interesting way, that the rise of that thing, the most entailing kind of like, you know, so many threads connecting capitalists together through credit, that system introduces the objective means by which to push beyond the capital relation itself. And so you're thinking, wait, but what about just like striking until the factories close? Like the credit system points the way to the future is a really interesting and baffling and provoking thing that he says, that it would be cool before we start asking folks what they think and what they want to ask you, because it's about the post-capitalist future, which is where you end the book.
Right.
You know, so could you just talk about that? I've never quite grasped that.
Yeah. Well, the credit system, Marx spends a lot, there's that long fifth part where finance and the credit system take center stage. And it's crucial. There's no capital system without a credit system. The credit system, and I won't go into this, but the credit system is the mechanism by which profit is redistributed in this greater project of, or moment of equalization that makes capital possible. The credit system is the way that equalization process amongst the capitalist class takes place. But it is, it's one of the places where Marx, and this happens punctually throughout the whole of Capital 3, but this is one of my favorite moments when the credit system turns into this transitional form that points right out of capitalism altogether, because it expresses the need for the capitalist class to pool their common wealth, right? The credit system is the socialization of the surplus itself, right? And the capitalist class needs this. No single capitalist could function without this kind of collectivizing of surplus that can be used, that could be drawn on, and that could be pulled in. And Marx says, well, what is this? But the potential for the socialization of wealth itself, which for Marx doesn't need to take its capitalist form. He says, this is something that we could use. He says, anything that comes after, any kind of post-capitalist scenario, is going to take advantage of things that capital introduces to history, and every one of them is an expression of this movement of socialization. Mm-hmm. So Marx says, what does the credit system represent at its core? The socialization of wealth. Yeah. It takes this distorted, upside-down form, capitalist form. He says, but think of it as separable, as something that you could separate from its capitalist form. And he says, what have you got? Well, you've got a common reservoir of wealth that can be exploited in all sorts of ways. And you do that any type of associated mode of production that we might want to imagine succeeding capital is going to need a common reservoir of wealth from which we can draw. Marx says, let's think of the credit system as this transitional form. And then he spins out this little scenario, but what could be possible? And he says, and then there's, and then he says, this is why the finance capitalist is both swindler and prophet. And prophet is P-R-O-P-H-E-T, that prophet, right? He says, because they're, in their capitalist form, they're swindlers, but in the not yet realized or maybe possible, or in Ernst Bloch's kind of sense of the non-contemporaneity of capital itself, what could be possible that is at the core of, because value is just socialization, it's just the movement of socialization. He says the credit system represents something that is quite interesting in its possibilities. Yeah.
I think that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's all I was going to say, is there's these moments of spinning these little utopian scenarios all the way through the book.
And I think that the way that you follow and ask us to follow the concept of value all the way to the very end gives us this one last amazing takeaway, which is that argument doesn't commit Marx or Marxists to a post-capitalist vision that is necessarily either the high-tech developmentalist, there's going to be factories but the workers own them version, or the anarchist version of everything's going to be like mid-sized smallholder farms with internet or whatever. That we'll figure that out, or we won't, but that those outcomes in themselves are just variable expressions or possible expressions of this thing that's behind them all, which is the value relation, which doesn't have to be hitched to surplus value per se. And so it doesn't commit you to one or the other of those old debates or old positions. Yeah. It's just one last cool thing that you give us before the book is over. So thank you. Do folks want to ask some questions, chime in, jump in? I mean, can just ask.
Can we first?
Oh, yeah.